Welcome to Rhythms of Faith. Welcome. We're thrilled to have you with us today, and we're also thrilled to welcome our guest, Sarah Kathleen Johnson, from a professor at St. Paul University. And I just wanted to start by asking, how did you get interested in liturgy?
Oh, I've been interested in liturgy for a long time. I've always just been very curious about what Christians do when they gather. So I even remember when I first got my driver's license when I was 16, one of the things I did was visit churches other than my own, just to see what was happening. And now that is my actual job, which is really quite miraculous.
You found it early, huh?
Yes. But part of that was, but I wouldn't visit on Sunday morning, because on Sunday morning I was involved in leadership in my own tradition as well. And I think that was another way in for me, was being invited into worship planning and leadership, and then having questions emerge from that. So that sort of curiosity and that opportunity for leadership. But then what's really kept me and drawn me more deeply into liturgical studies is the way that it is this intersection point between the theology that people live every day and academic theology. And that bridging of church and academy is really key for me. And liturgical studies just sits at that intersection.
Absolutely.
And then the other piece too is how it brings together different disciplines. And in liturgical studies, I get to do some history and some theology and quite a lot of social science and bring those pieces together. And I don't have to choose. I get to think about integrating those different ways of knowing.
Yeah, totally. And what is your tradition?
So my tradition of origin and ordination is Mennonite Church Canada.
Great. Thanks.
And so you just had a book come out and called Occasional Religious Practice. And we were hoping that you would tell us a little bit about both the social science methods that you use in that project, and also kind of what are some key takeaway points? What are occasional religious practitioners? What would you like to tell us about that?
Yes, so this book introduces the concept of occasional religious practice as a way of describing a very ordinary way of relating to religion, which is participating in religious practices occasionally rather than routinely, and often in connection with certain types of occasions, like holidays or life transitions or times of crisis. And this is one of the ways that many people relate to religion in the global north. Many of us can recognize this immediately in our own lives or in the lives of our families. So the book tries to introduce that concept by really anchoring it in that ordinary experience and listening to the stories of occasional practitioners. My point of access there is people who are participating in baptisms or funerals in the Anglican tradition in Toronto. So taking that as a starting point, but then being able to see these patterns in many different contexts and traditions.
Yeah, and so a lot of times when we think about religion, like we define it in terms of like explicit belief. And why did you choose not to do that when you were doing this work?
Yeah, so there are a few ways that religion is often defined, and one is belief. Another is affiliation, so the traditions that people sort of claim an identification with, and then another is sort of what functions religion has in people's lives. And those are all good and important ways of thinking about what religion is. But I find a focus on practice and how people are participating in religious practices allows us to see the diversity of people that are present on the occasions of those practices, who have many different religious identities. They claim a lot of different affiliations, who would have a lot of different beliefs, and who those practices would be functioning in very different ways for them. And by focusing on the practices as an entry point, we can see those other forms of diversity that are present on those occasions.
How did you find that information? Like, how did you gather your data about what those different types of practices mean to people?
So I did a qualitative study in the Anglican tradition in Toronto. So I interviewed people who were connected to baptisms and funerals, and just took their experience of that event as a starting point. Just tell me the story of the baptism, or tell me the story of the funeral, and then listen to those stories. And in those stories, they talk a lot about how they would understand their own connection to that tradition. How they made the decision to enter into this practice, who else was part of their community who was there as well. And then I would ask them for suggestions for other people to talk to as well. So I'd have these different perspectives, even on the same baptism or the same funeral, from people who were there for different reasons and understood the event in different ways.
Yeah. And what surprised you about what you learned from these interviews?
Oh, I think one of the main things that I take away from it is just the diversity of vocational practitioners. There's a lot of assumptions out there about who occasional practitioners are, but really hearing the stories shows that it's important not to make assumptions about why someone is participating in a practice or what it means for them, but to really try to meet them where they are and understand that ritual, that liturgy from their perspective.
Yeah. And so in asking them, what were some of the kind of interesting stories that you heard from the particular interviews?
Well, one of the patterns that was really striking to me was how many, especially mothers affiliated with who would identify as Roman Catholic, would be choosing to have Anglican baptisms for their children for various reasons, either looking for a tradition that was more flexible around who could be a godparent, for example, or that had kind of some more progressive theological emphases alongside really traditional ritual forms that would feel familiar as well. And that those stories often defied my expectations in different ways. I think of one woman who was baptized as an adult in order to serve as the godmother at the baptism of one of her nieces or nephews. So that we wouldn't expect that that's a motivation for adult baptism, which is often put more in that kind of belief category.
Totally.
But how important that was for her family, that relational motivation, and then how she interpreted that event through that framework of relationship.
Yeah. What were some of her insights about how she interpreted it?
Oh, just the importance of those family relationships in the event, and how it wasn't really about the conceptual content. It's about those relationships. And then what stands out about the event are things like the water, the people who are there, the space that it's in, the clothing that is worn, the candle, these sort of material aspects of it. And then just the relational connections and the emotional connections between the participants who are present, and how all of those things are really important aspects of participation in liturgy for many of us. It's just more apparent in the case of vocational practitioners who aren't falling back on routine practice or kind of abstract theological concepts to explain their liturgical experience.
Right.
So this really tries to value those relational motivations or those cultural motivations and say, this is a good way of being religious too. And this is a very ordinary way of being religious too.
Yeah, it really grounds like the conversation around what, like people's practice in religion, rather than this kind of lofty sense of like, do you believe or don't you believe? It's what did you think about the water that they poured on the child's head or something like that? It really kind of makes it about what we're doing now rather than something that is harder to understand maybe.
Yeah, or there's this assumption that's very common among participants in practices, as well as among liturgical theologians, that everyone present is kind of formally affiliated with the tradition and fully on board with all of the formal belief structure and routinely practicing and morally compliant with that tradition and is emotionally engaged in the practice. And very quickly, all of those assumptions fall away when we start paying attention to who's really there, what they're experiencing, how they're reflecting on that experience.
Yeah. How do those assumptions hinder us, you think?
I think one of the things they do is they tend to make people feel really alone. Like they're the only one who's not aligning with all of those assumptions, when in fact many other people who are present are not aligning with those assumptions as well. So being a bit more open about naming some of that is a way for those who are there for many different reasons, many different motivations, to recognize that, to honestly acknowledge it. And then that can be more of a starting point for conversation, for more of a dialogue about what is this practice meaning and doing for everyone present. If we set aside those assumptions, we can really enter into a different kind of relationship and conversation and dialogue among people who relate to religion in different ways. Yeah,
that's beautiful. It's really the assumptions inhibit a communal connection that is possible if we kind of set them aside almost, right?
Yeah. And of course, all of us, I think, have variations in kind of our affiliations and beliefs over time too. So we also kind of have to shelve that or maybe not be honest about it. Thinking about this as a way of speaking to people who are religiously diverse but are practicing together is, of course, why we brought you to the class last year to talk about occasional religious practice, especially to apply this concept and the non-judgmental way that you approach that concept to the cooperation in our class between people of various religious traditions, people of no religious tradition, people with varying understandings of faith and doubt, and even people who are not entirely sure what they believe at this point in their life. So could you talk a little bit about how maybe you would encourage our students to be informed by this as they're working with people who don't believe the same things as them to write music together?
Well, the class is such a wonderful occasion for dialogue among people who relate to religion in different ways. And it's not the standard kind of occasion like a Christmas Eve service or a baptism or a funeral or a time of crisis, but it is this kind of specific event that has brought together this very unique community of people who bring different motivations and then are reflecting theologically together, being creative together. And that just creates that space for dialogue. So I think especially setting aside those assumptions about what it means to be religious in the right way or in a way that that sort of aligns with this kind of imagined ideal, but instead to really meet one another in the class where they are, to really understand and value the diverse ways that people relate to religion, the different religious identities they bring, the different motivations they have for being part of this creative, reflective, theological process.
You know, it's interesting. I don't know that I even told you this after the students last year developed the sense of what their liturgy was going to be, but they actually did choose, in essence, to make it what you and I would call a crisis rite, because they were thinking about the stresses of being a college student and the stresses of finals week. And so that it actually was kind of, in a way, a really solid occasional practice in the way that you've studied them.
That is really interesting. That it became that the sort of almost occasional nature of the class led to a response to crisis, as something that could bring people together across all of that difference through that shared experience.
I think it really worked, and I think it's part of the reason that the class felt such solidarity with each other at the end, is that they really were focused on being with one another through this experience of the class, which of course wasn't a crisis, I hope not, but and also supporting one another through the discernment of being an undergraduate student and through the process of musical composition, which for many of them was new and uncomfortable and maybe a little fearsome.
Can you talk a little bit about the qualitative methods that you used? You interviewed people. Once you interviewed them, what did you do with all the information that you collected?
Yeah, so in this project, I was interviewing people. There are 61 interviews that were part of it. I was also observing liturgies, especially baptisms and funerals and Christmas and Easter, but also routine liturgies as well. And I was doing some archival research in addition to that. So gathering all of this data and then really trying to listen deeply to it in disciplined ways. So all of the interviews are transcribed. And then I code them using qualitative data analysis software. So that's really an interpretive process of going through and assigning themes to different segments of those conversations.
Yeah.
And that allows for drawing together across multiple conversations these common themes and noticing some of the patterns that emerge there.
Yeah, and when you say you observe the liturgies, can you break that open for us a little bit? Obviously you are Sarah, who is a person observing a liturgy that is happening, but there's also a lot underneath the surface when you say that you observe it, I think, when you talk about ritual studies and some of the disciplines that are important for you to embody when entering into that. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so being as fully present as possible to that liturgy, paying attention with all of the senses and being very aware that I'm part of the story too, that I'm not some sort of objective, distant observer, but I'm in the scene. and I'm experiencing it as only I would.
Mm-hmm.
And then to write up a detailed account of that experience. And writing field notes, especially on repeated visits to the same congregation, can feel very, it's kind of excruciatingly boring after a while, because there's such subtle variations. But those subtle variations become very important for analysis later on.
Mm-hmm.
And noticing things like the temperature in the room, or what the people around me are doing or not doing, or how they're using their cameras during a baptism service or not, and what's said about that. Just all of these details are part of telling the story and part of seeing how people are experiencing and interpreting that experience.
Yeah. So part of where your insights are coming from, and correct me if I'm wrong here, is as you are present to a particular community or religious practice longer, the subtle differences start to become more apparent, and you're able to make maybe what seem like more like routine observations that are slightly different because of the temperature, for example. But what's do you have an example of like how what one of the insights that you would have gleaned from this sort of like more longitudinal, I guess, right? Like you're the gift of your time is what's enabling your insight. Where's something that you would have noticed a change there or an observation?
Oh, well, one of the most obvious ones with occasional practice is how different Christmas Eve is than the Sunday after Christmas.
Okay.
So Christmas Eve, it's just at the Anglican Cathedral in Toronto, it's just completely packed, every seat taken, and a very different community of people gathered, lots of intergenerational families. Just a very different community. And even though the liturgy is somewhat similar on Christmas Eve to the Sunday after Christmas, a lot of a similar musical repertoire, for example, kind of classic Christmas carols, both Eucharistic liturgies in the Anglican tradition. But then it's very different. I think the Sunday after Christmas, I was surrounded by empty pews in that space. But there's still a community that's gathered, which just reveals the difference that then is in the affect of the space and how people are entering into it. So there's just some really obvious things like that I think many people can recognize if they're a routine or intensive practitioner who practices regularly.
Yeah. What did you notice about the regulars, like the ministers and the musicians who were, going from Christmas Eve to the Sunday after? Like, obviously they have a different, you're kind of on the top of the world on Christmas Eve because the place is packed, but I think there's a lot of different reactions to those experiences. I do interview Anglican priests in this research as well, partly because they're working with a lot of different families around these occasions, but also to speak about those experiences on Christmas or Easter. And there are some who love those occasions and that kind of energy that's present there, but there are others who struggle with that experience as well. But I think there's a lot of awareness that this is very present. And one of the gifts of naming it occasional religious practice is finding ways to talk about that. Yeah, right.
And recognize it and recognize how it shapes ministry.
Yeah.
And some clergy do resent occasional practice.
Sure.
And one of my main hopes for this research is really to shift attitudes toward occasional practice and invite everyone to see these occasions as opportunities for dialogue, and to really learn from one another as people who may be more routinely or intensively religious, and as those who are occasional practitioners and have a diversity of identities and ways of relating to religion.
That's beautiful.
Let's talk a little bit about your current work. I'm especially interested in having you give us a little bit of insight into your work on young people in Christian worship right now. So would you tell us a little bit about how that project is going?
So right now, I'm collaborating with a couple of other scholars, Nelson Cowan and Emily Snyder-Andrews, on a study of young people in Christian worship. And these young people who we are interviewing are not generally occasional practitioners. They are highly religious. But what we're doing is really trying to understand worship from the perspective of high school students and emerging adults. So we've been interviewing college students who are involved in leadership of worship-focused summer programs for teenagers, and then leading focus groups with the high school students who are part of those programs, and really asking them about their experience. What's an ordinary worship service like in their communities? What's an example of a memorable worship service? in their wildest dreams, what would the best worship service ever be like? And to really try to understand these very ordinary experiences of worship, but from the perspective of people who are at that life stage, age 13 to 29.
What's the most interesting question that's emerged for you from that work so far?
There are so many questions.
Okay,
partly,
the 3 most interesting questions. I'm open.
Partly related to my work with occasional practitioners, it's made me more interested in materiality and emotion, embodiment, affect, kind of these non-discursive, non-representational dimensions of liturgical experience that are really important for both highly religious teenagers and occasional practitioners who in this research tend to be older than that demographic and who are in very different traditions, but there are these threads that run through the data that point to the affective dimensions, the embodied dimensions as a maybe surprising point of commonality across very different traditions, very different experiences.
Can you break that open for us a little? What do you mean when you say affective or embodied?
Yeah, how the participants in this research describe a memorable experience of worship, for example, which is often associated with some sort of emotional encounter, which they might name also an encounter with the divine.
Mm-hmm.
But then how that emotional encounter is described is often through very physical language. It's felt in the body. That feeling is felt through chills or through a sense of weight or lightness. And then it's also expressed physically through posture or gesture, or else posture or gesture like kneeling or raising hands are used to shape that feeling to, and to see those patterns present. This is a very ecumenical study. So to see those patterns present in Roman Catholic communities, as well as in evangelical communities, in mainline Protestant communities, to see them present in different ways and to just try to find ways to name that unnameable experience and access it. And it seems like emotion and embodiment are some of the ways into that aspect of encounter with the divine.
Yeah. Okay.
I know a lot of these camps are like music focused, or there's a really intensive set of musical practices. How would thinking about these dimensions of experience, like how do you think that should shape how we think about liturgical music or music in a liturgical setting? Of course, our students are trying to compose liturgical music for the first time, but even if we're thinking about selecting or participating in liturgical music, what do you think would be helpful to consider?
Yes. Yeah. A lot of the participants in this research are musicians, and the worship programs tend to be focused on the arts. So we're interviewing people who are spending a couple of weeks learning to be part of a worship band or learning to be a cantor and to chant. So there are these different, very concrete musical skills that they're learning, and then learning to lead others into. I think one of the key, or there's a couple of key things to keep in mind. One is how much people are formed within particular traditions. And there's this narrative out there that certain generations prefer certain expressions of music. And that really doesn't hold up in this research, that people are really formed to learn to love the traditions in which they participate. And we see that across camps that use different, or summer programs, conferences that use different expressions of worship music as their dominant form. And that there's really a deep appreciation for a breadth of musical expressions. And it's very closely tied to what is known and familiar and what is taught and what participants lead, rather than it is to age. So we see that appreciation for musical diversity that's really formed in particular traditions. So there's that aspect of people learning to love their own tradition. But then there's also just the recognition that the participants in this research are really diverse, and they have different perspectives on liturgical music, and they're not all the same. Not all young people prefer one expression of worship, even if it's worship music, even if it's the dominant one in their tradition. There's still diversity there.
Right. Oh, that's really helpful. I'm really interested in, of course, the ecumenical dimension of this study, extending across different liturgical traditions, different Christian traditions with different belief sets. And I want to draw attention to your experience within different contexts. You did your doctorate here at Notre Dame with us, and now you're the director of Anglican Studies at St. Paul University, which is a Catholic university. And you're an ordained Mennonite minister with leadership roles in your own denomination. How do you see these different traditions enriching one another in dialogue?
I find there's just so many gifts that can be shared across traditions, that can be given and that can be received. And those gifts, some of them are musical. That's one of the ways that there's been a lot of ecumenical sharing in the 20th and 21st centuries is common repertoires emerging across Christian traditions, including sort of Protestant hymnody of the past 400 years and also contemporary worship music of the last 40 years, that there's really a shared repertoire in both of those spaces, as well as the music emerging from the Catholic liturgical renewal, which has been so widely received beyond Roman Catholic context. So there is that musical sharing that happens, but I do think that there's a theological sharing that happens through that as well. And that there are some difficult questions that emerge. There are questions of authority tend to be central, especially in terms of the agency of local communities. A lot of the young people in Christian Worship Project is based in free church traditions. Some of my own research is based in free church traditions where there's a lot of congregational autonomy and choices about worship, where there's a strong sense of separation from state authority, where individuals have a lot of agency in choosing which tradition and congregation they're part of. Yeah. And just that creates a different context for planning and leading Christian worship. But there's a lot that can be learned in that space from more structured and centralized traditions. And then I think there's also things that more structured and centralized traditions can learn from those that are navigating that more fluid and decentralized liturgical context.
Yeah. Of course, music is actually one of the places where the Catholic tradition is the most decentralized among, many traditional things. And so that's one of the reasons this class is a good, I think, space for engaging with different concepts.
I feel like I'd be remiss to lose this opportunity when we have two professors of liturgy, because we keep talking about my first question was, how did you get interested in liturgy? But we keep saying worship music, liturgical music. I wonder if just for a second we can get you guys to talk about liturgy versus worship. What are we actually kind of talking about? And I know that there's, we only have a couple minutes, and you could probably talk about it for ages, but just for it's a little more context on the terminology.
Oh, it's one of the really challenging things working across these contexts for me, is that these words mean entirely different things to different people in different spaces. So when I'm working with Mennonites, I tend not to use the word liturgy because it's assumed to mean fixed text or a certain expression of worship that's more structured. And therefore it's kind of unhelpful because when I think about liturgy in terms of the scholarly study of liturgy, it's really anything that is part of or connected to the activity of a Christian community, that's the ritual activity of a Christian community that's gathered.
So very broad.
In that sense, yes. Pentecostal worship is no more or less liturgical than Roman Catholic worship in terms of how I would speak of it academically. Yeah. But in the ground, one of the challenges of interviewing the young people who are part of this research is they also use the language of liturgy and worship very differently. So we have versions of the interview guide. This is the one that we use at Catholic sites. This is the one that we use at evangelical sites, because we know that we need to think about how the language will connect with the participants in the research and kind of translate it into their own terminology.
Very cool.
Yeah, this reflects my experience precisely. And actually, like in ecumenical dialogues, this reflects my experience as well. So like in the ecumenical dialogue with the Pentecostals, the members of that dialogue who are Pentecostal are really comfortable with the word liturgy, and they understand it in this broad fashion, but their communities wouldn't. So it is really about navigating an audience and whereas in Catholic settings, the word worship connotes a like very specific kind of liturgical orientation that we wouldn't necessarily expect to dominate every liturgical service. So it's very, for me, it is just very contextual.
Yeah. So they might mean the same thing. They might not.
In liturgical studies, they mean the same thing.
Right.
So like when we're talking to our professional peers, those two words are synonymous.
Okay.
And it really is about when you're communicating to people outside the field, which one is the most appropriate word to use in this setting.
Cool.
Yes. Yeah. And the word worship is also understood in various ways too, especially in terms of being a specific component of especially of praise and worship, that an extended time of worship primarily through music, or if it refers to the whole worship service or the sort of act of attributing worth to God, that all of those layers are present too in the Protestant context where we do this research. So very often we have to really emphasize, we're talking about the whole worship service, from what happens when you arrive to when you leave, not just a time of extended singing.
Right.
So really needing to emphasize that.
Another one of those words, like the word service, which means like really is the equivalent of like what Catholics would call liturgy or mass in a Protestant context. And when you say that in a Catholic context, people don't necessarily know what you're talking about.
Right.
So this comes up all the time in ecumenical settings as well. Yeah, so service is really the default word for like the whole thing.
Right. I wondered if we could go back for 1 second, just because when you're talking about the young people and the different ways of kind of understanding their experience through the affective or embodied elements of it, is there, or have you found correlation between that sort of leadership formation that you guys are witnessing or facilitating and the prevalence of these impactful, affective, or embodied experiences?
We're in such an early stage of analysis of this data. We still have a whole other phase of fieldwork coming up this summer. So it's really hard to make specific connections between experiences of leadership and those affective and embodied aspects of worship at this point. I think another factor in this qualitative work is that we're really speaking mostly to leaders, that everyone in these summer programs is involved at least in leadership in that context, and often in their campus ministry or their high school or their home parish as well, that they've kind of opted into a leadership context.
It's like interviewing your choir about this.
But we are also doing a large survey that's more representative of the population of the U.S. That still only is distributed to people who've attended at least 2 in-person worship services in the last year. But we hope to be able to situate this data with highly religious young people in this broader context through the survey, just to get a sense for, we really value what we're hearing from them, but how is that similar or different from what we might hear from those who are less routine in their practice or who are less likely to be in leadership in
I can't wait to hear the answer to that, because I would love to know, like the choir compared to occasional practitioners or who are not involved in a direct ministry, like is there experience of some kind of profound impactful experience more prevalent or not? You know, it's a fascinating question.
Well, one thing I would keep in mind, I did do a study of one of the liturgical choirs here on campus when I was doing my doctoral work, partly because it was a point of access to a religiously diverse group that is participating routinely in the Catholic Mass in the Basilica, and just how much diversity there was within that community in terms of how they understood their religious identity, in terms of their motivations for participation, which were sometimes much more relational in terms of that sense of community, or more musical in terms of wanting to develop those skills in these really elite choir settings, and didn't have as much of the kind of explicitly spiritual motivation too. So I found that diversity is present even in a group of really committed routine leaders. It's important to keep that in mind too, because they often didn't recognize that about one another. So everyone was also making that assumption, oh, everyone here is so much more religious than me. I'm the only non-Catholic in this choir.
We're all the same here.
And when we start looking at it, no, there's actually a lot of non-Catholics in this choir, a lot of people who are here for different reasons and who are experiencing the same thing in quite different ways.
Yeah. Cool.
And that work of yours was actually like influential for me as I was developing this course and thinking about how we could encourage students to participate in it fully, regardless of where they found themselves on that spectrum of participation and of belief. So thanks for doing that work.
Yeah.
It's already been really helpful for us.
You got the next one?
Sure. Yeah. We want to know your favorite piece of liturgical music, or that's probably too much of an ask. We usually tone that down to a piece of liturgical music that you'd like to talk about today.
I appreciate that nuancing. Because I do find in another part of my life, I was on the editorial team for a hymnal, Voices Together,
Right.
A hymnal of Mennonite Church Canada and Mennonite Church USA, published in 2020. And then it's like, as I flip through that book, it's like every page is like a photo in a photo album, and it has a story, and it has people, and it has a context that's received it. So it's really hard to choose just one. But the piece that came to mind as I was reflecting on this is a song called Word and Sign, which is a text written by Adam Tice, who was the text editor for that hymnal. And then it was set to music, actually, when he'd submitted it anonymously, and the music editor for the hymnal selected it anonymously and wrote a beautiful tune for it.
Oh, wow.
And it's a short song, just a few lines, and it's just very, very contemplative, really reflective, and it just connects me to that project and to those colleagues who've been so formative for me in my own reflection on music and worship.
That's wonderful. And so for you too, there's this relational connection, even as you're a liturgical scholar with a lot of abstract language at your command. But this is still one of the things that draws you to a specific piece of liturgical music.
Yes. And I could analyze all of the emotion and embodiment in that text, but when it comes down to it, a lot of it is the context and the relationships and the way it's been present in my own life on important occasions.
Yeah.
That's awesome. Well, we finish every episode by asking the same question, which is, if you had to choose to be an animal, which one would you choose and why?
So I'm not really an animal person. So I think I would choose to be a tree.
Okay.
So I
wondered if you were going there.
Yeah. To be deeply rooted, to be growing, to be branching out, to be a place of shelter or rest or service. But I think connected to the natural world, connected to the earth.
Great answer.
But as a tree.
Awesome.
So.
I love it.
I love it when people refuse to answer our questions as they're framed. It's actually like a real liberating moment for JJ
so
and I.
Great.
So yeah, we really appreciate that. Sarah, thanks for coming all this way from Ottawa to be with us today. And thanks to all of you for joining us here on the Rhythms of Faith podcast.